Welcome back to another Outlook VBA tutorial. So today we're going to cover an interesting topic. So this topic was actually inspired by somebody who had asked a question on a particular video that I had created. So it was in the comments and they were asking because I think that particular video, if I remember correctly, was the one where we were taking tables from Excel and putting them into an Outlook email. Or maybe it was, I think, putting it maybe into a Word document. I honestly can't remember, but it was one of those two. And they had asked a very simple question, which was like, well, great, I can see how to take the information into Outlook or Word from Excel. How do I do the reverse? And I said, well, that's actually an interesting question. And so I said, well, give me a minute or two and let me see if I can kind of figure it out. And so eventually I was able to get the code work. And I said, well, this actually seems like a very interesting topic that I think a lot of people might find interesting. So I do want to cover this topic just because I think it's useful. And I don't really think I can find much online where they're kind of doing this. And so what we're going to do in today's video is we're going to take a table object inside of an email, copy it from that email into the Excel application. Now, I do want to be a little bit upfront with this. I'm not going to tell you I'm not going to say it's going to work with every type of email out there. So obviously we receive emails from a wide range of different providers. There's no guarantee that it's always going to work like that. However, I think for the most part, it should work pretty relatively well. And then additionally, we're going to keep it simple right now and just take a single email. And I can tell you for a fact, because I sent this email to myself, that this was using a table object. So a table object that we've used inside of VBA. So I know I'm working with a table object. I'm going to be doing this topic a little bit more, so I have to do some more research on it. And I want to see, will this same methodology work across emails that were written, for example, using the Gmail editor? Would it still work the same? So I'm kind of curious to see what happens and see if it's able to maintain its consistency behind it. Regardless, if you do receive emails from somebody who you know is using Microsoft Office, then really the idea behind this is you can now extract content from those emails in a programmatic fashion and then export it to the application of your choice. So I think that's really neat. And I think for the most part, it's pretty interesting stuff. All right. With that being said, let's get started. We definitely want to go into our Visual Basic editor. So make sure from your developer tab that you click the Visual Basic icon. And then from here, if you haven't already, you want to make sure that you insert a module. So you just go over here to your Project Explorer, right click in modules, and then go down to Insert and then Module. And then you can insert that new module. Well, I already have a module in here because I've written many modules using Outlook, so I don't need to do it again, but we're just going to use the one that I currently have. And then from here, this particular video is going to leverage some reference libraries. And so basically those reference libraries allow us to access different objects from the application that we are currently in. And really the idea behind that is that I'm in Outlook. I might want to access Word objects. I might want to access Excel objects. Currently, I can do that, but I'm not going to get the IntelliSense feature where I'll get code completion and things like that. So it's never going to necessarily hint to me if I wrote something wrong. It's never going to help me give me a list of options to say, hey, using this particular object, you have this method and that property and XYZ. So I use early binding, which basically means I enable the reference library and then I specify what type of object it is. So my opinion is I like doing it because it makes code faster. It makes coding faster. The only downside is you do want to make sure that if you send, usually if it's like in a Word document or if it's in, if it's in an Excel workbook, that if you're using reference libraries that talk to other applications, that you make sure that those reference libraries actually exist on the user's computer. So you want to make sure that if you're on PowerPoint 2016, that they're on PowerPoint 2016 as well, because otherwise it can create some issues. So to enable those reference libraries, you go up to Tools, down to References. And then from here, you'll see this nice little dialog box. And you'll notice I actually have them enabled because when I wrote the code, I had to enable them. So they're already enabled. And the reason I can tell that is because they have those check marks in those little boxes. And then additionally, if you've never used them before in Outlook, you're not going to see them right up here at the top. You want to actually scroll down a little bit to M for Microsoft. And so your Excel one's going to be right around here in the E section. And then your Word one will be right here. And so what you want to do is make sure that you just check those boxes. So you just want to check those boxes. So if they have a checkbox in them, you're good to go. And then press OK. You now have access to those reference libraries. Okay, then from here, we can write our subroutine. So we'll call this export Outlook table to Excel. Okay, and then from here, we're going to declare our variables. So we're going to be using different object variables inside of our routine. So we want to make sure that we define what those object variables are. The first one is going to be called OLookInspector, and this is going to represent an inspector object. So the inspector object, if you want to know, I guess, a more real life example, anytime you're inspecting an object inside of Outlook, whether that be an appointment, an email, a journal item, a task, a contact, most of those, you're inspecting it, and that is leveraging the inspector object. And so what we can do is we can reference the inspector that we're currently using, and we'll find that most of them have an editor behind the scenes. And that editor behind the scenes is where we can access the Word object model with it. So right now, technically, I would consider this my inspector because I'm using it to inspect my mail item object. Additionally, we will be working with an email. So I'm going to create a new variable called OLookEmail. This will be a mail item object. This represents basically an email in Outlook. Additionally, we will be working with some Word variables. And so with these, we're going to be working specifically with what we would call a document object. So technically, when you are editing an email, for example, that is considered a document object from the VBA object model perspective. So when you're technically editing those emails, think of it as a Word document. That's why you see a lot of similar functionality when you're editing an email that you would see if you were writing a document in Word. It's because it's leveraging the same exact object model, which I think is super cool. I think that kind of just shows how everything's interconnected. And then additionally, we are going to also be working with a Word table. So this is a table object, and obviously you can guess what this is. This is a table object inside the email. Now, from our perspective, that's this guy right here. So that is an actual table object. I know it's a table object because I wrote the email and I inserted a table. So it's a table object from basically the Word perspective. Additionally, we are going to also have some Excel variables. So these are the variables that are going to be associated with our Excel object model. The first one is going to be the application as a whole. So Excel has its own application object. We're going to create a new application object. And then once we have that application object, we're going to insert a workbook. So I'm going to also declare an Excel.workbook object that represents the entire workbook I just created. And then finally, I want to make sure that workbook has a worksheet. So this is going to represent an Excel worksheet object, so an actual worksheet inside that workbook. So once you've done that, you've defined all the variables you actually need for this simple little script. Once you've done that, we can now grab the mail item. So basically, we're going to grab the email item, if you want to think of it like that. So grab the mail item. Now, because it is an object that's going to be returned back to us, we're going to use the set keyword, and we're going to say set OLook mail item. So that object variable equal, I'm going to call my application object. So the Outlook application. That Outlook application has a method that is called Active Explorer. The Active Explorer basically is what you're using to explore Outlook, right? So this is my Explorer. And so there's actually different explorers inside of Outlook, but normally the one you're going to be working with is usually the active one. And then that Active Explorer has a current folder property. That represents the current folder that I'm in. Now, some cases you got to be careful because depending on what kind of Explorer you're working with, there might not necessarily be a direct folder object there. But in our case, because we're working inside of my inbox, The current folder is my inbox folder. Now, every folder has an items collection. The items collection is all the different items in that folder. The thing with Outlook that you got to be careful of is the items collection contains all items, not all similar items. So it's going to include appointment items, email items, journal items. So there's everything in there. So when you're working with the items collection, there's basically different things you can do. You can either use the index, so the order in which basically the item exists in that collection, or you can use a keyword. So I'm going to call the items property. And if you want to search for a specific email, if you know the name of that email, you can just type it in. In my case, the name of the email is called My Sample Table. Now, how did I know that? Well, if I go here to my email, you'll notice My Sample Table. My Sample Table. That's the name of the email. So I can grab the email by the name. So I have an email. What does the email contain? Well, the email contains an inspector. The inspector is what I'm using to inspect that email. So grab the email inspector. Grab the active inspector. So I'm going to set my OLOOK inspector object equal to my OLOOK mail item object. There is a get inspector property. So that returns the inspector. From here, I also want to grab the word editor that exists inside my inspector object. Now, this is where things get a little bit confusing. So grab the word editor object. This returns the word object model. So I'm going to set my OLOOK word doc equal to my OLOOK inspector. And then I'm going to do word editor. Now, if you are a little bit confused about this, don't worry. But I think it's important to know that that word editor property is actually a very unique property. It represents the word object model that's being displayed. So this is kind of our access point inside to the word object model. However, you do want to understand that it doesn't always exist. It only exists if if the word editor is word mail, so if it returns true, and the editor type property is OL editor word. So this kind of brings me back to my original topic. I don't know how comprehensive this method will work because, again, if technically it doesn't return this, I haven't technically validated to say, is it going to work? So I still have to work a little bit more on it, but right now with ones where it returns that true property, then we know this methodology should work. So once we've grabbed that word editor object, it's weird because even though it represents the word object model, it's also returning a document object in a sense. So we can actually consider it as a document. With that document, we're going to grab the table from it, but we're going to do that in a little bit. Now what I want to do is I want to create a new Excel application. Now there's technically different ways to do this. So we can set Excel app equal to a new Excel application. Now, I think it also kind of pays to understand that I'm assuming that the user does not have Excel open. Technically, if they have it open, I don't really need to create a new Excel application. I could just grab the active instance. So if you want to grab the active instance, this is what it would look like. You would still set Excel app equal, but you're going to do get, and then if you do object, comma, and it's a string, Excel period application. That's basically the program ID. So this is how you would do it if you want the active instance. Now, I don't currently have Excel open, so I'm not going to be grabbing the active instance because it doesn't exist. Then from here, I'm going to add a new workbook. So I'm going to set my Excel book equal to my Excel app. I'm going to do my workbooks collection, and I'm going to call the add method. So remember, an application has a workbooks collection, represents all the workbooks in that application. And then if I call the add method, it simply adds a new workbook to that collection. Now, keep in mind, when you open it, if you do have a personal macro workbook, you already have one to begin with. Then from here, we're going to add a new worksheet. Just because I have a book doesn't mean I have a worksheet. So I'm going to set my Excel worksheet equal to my Excel book. I'm going to go into the worksheets collection, and then I'm going to do add. Now, sometimes I think people kind of naturally want to add these all in one line. I like breaking it out. I think it's just easier and a little bit more intuitive. But, technically speaking, you could go and keep doing it like that if you wanted to. But for me, I like kind of breaking it out. I think it's a little bit more easier to follow as you're doing it. Okay, and then from here, now we can grab the word table. So grab the word table. What does that look like? Well, we're going to set our OLOOK word table object equal to my OLOOK Word document. Now you'll notice I have all the different methods and properties that are related to a document object. So if I do tables, that represents the tables collection. And so I know that there's only one table on my email. So what I'm going to do is say, grab the first table. Once I've done that, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the table. So I'm going to say, OLOOK Word table dot range. So there's a range property which represents the entire table range. And then there's a copy method. And then once I've copied that table, I can paste it. Now you need to be very careful about your paste. Very careful. You need to paste it using the worksheet object. Paste it to the worksheet. Let me show you something. If I do Excel app and I do range and I do A1 and I just do paste special, I don't specify any paste type, it will paste it as an image. You probably don't want an image. You probably want the actual data, right? So the better way to do it, so that way you get basically a formatted table, is you do Excel worksheet. The worksheet has a paste method, not paste special, just a paste. And then there's a destination argument where you can specify the destination you want to paste it to. So if you don't specify the destination, guess where it goes? It's going to go in range A1. So if you want it somewhere more specific, then you can use this component, the destination argument, to change that location. Now, for simplicity, I'm just going to put it in A1. But if you wanted to, you could technically do it at a different range. So at this point, I have everything I need to, in a sense, execute my code, assuming I have no major errors. So let's see what happens when we run it. Uh-oh, I forgot something very, very important. Just because I have an Excel application doesn't mean it's visible. So I want to make sure that I can actually see my Excel application. So I need to make the Excel application visible. It's funny, when I first recorded this video, I skipped this one too, again, and I keep skipping it. But if you call the visible property and you set it equal to true, it makes sure that we can see it. So I think this also kind of makes an interesting point. If you go down below and you open up your task manager, we should see it. You see it? So it's active. This is what causes all sorts of issues with COM objects sometimes. So sometimes an instance will be running behind the scenes. And so when you're trying to grab an active instance or grab a new instance, it can create all sorts of basically madness. What I usually tell people is check to see if you have any running instances. So now that I've killed that instance, I should run it again. So now I should see it. And we can now see that it copied the entire table over into my Excel workbook, which I think is awesome. So now you have the capability, at least with one table, to copy it into an Excel workbook. Now, I think this is also neat too, because this is where great ideas come from people who watch the videos and then just put out suggestions. I do read them. I know some people, they might be like, oh, he doesn't read. I read them a lot. And especially if they're interesting ones, I think that a lot of people could benefit from seeing it, I'm more than happy to do a video on it. And I thought this was a pretty neat one. So um, I'm not going to give out their name, but thank you for sharing your comments. But yeah, I think at this point we've done a simple example. I think in our next example, we'll do a more complicated one. So we'll do multiple emails. I'll also assume that, hey, maybe there's like 5 or 3 tables in there. So let's not just assume there's one. I'd like to kind of expand it from there and see, hey, can we do different types of objects? Can we make this even more dynamic? Things like that. Because I think this is interesting. I thought this was an interesting way of asking a question. And, we usually take everything from Excel and then put it into some other application. Why not do it the other way around? You never know what you'd get, right? So if you have any questions, feel free to put them down in the comments below, and I'll do my best to get back to you. Other than that, we will see you in our next video.